The word knight comes from the Old English chinite, meaning servant or boy, but it wasn't until the early Middle Ages, around the 8th to 9th century, that the role of knights started to emerge as we know it today. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of feudalism, local lords needed warriors to protect their land. Out of this chaos rose a new class of mounted warriors, the knights. Initially, being a knight wasn't about honor, it was about violence. These were the elite fighters of their time, trained to kill, loyal to their lords, and often rewarded with land for their service. Only later would knights be wrapped in the myths of romance and honor. So, how did one become a knight? It wasn't as easy as picking up a sword. It was a lifelong journey, beginning as early as age 7. A noble boy would start as a page, serving in a lord's household. He learned manners, religion, reading, writing, and began basic combat training, swordplay, horsemanship, and archery. He also learned to serve, carrying messages, setting tables, and helping the ladies of the court. By age 14, the page became a squire. Now, the real training began. The squire served a knight directly, caring for his armor and horse, sharpening swords, and even accompanying him into battle. Squires were expected to fight if needed, and this was their test of bravery. Around the age of 21, if proven worthy, a squire would be knighted in a dubbing ceremony, either on the battlefield for bravery or in a more formal church ritual. The sword was tapped on his shoulders, and he swore oaths of loyalty, faith, and protection. He was now a knight, a warrior with both privilege and responsibility. Becoming a knight was just the beginning. Maintaining your status meant constant training. Knights practiced with weapons like longswords, lances, maces, and axes. They trained in hand-to-hand combat, jousting, and horseback riding. They wore armor. First chainmail in the early Middle Ages, then full-plate armor in later centuries. Despite what you might think, a well-made suit of plate armor wasn't clunky. It was surprisingly mobile and custom-fitted. A knight could run, jump, and even mount a horse with it on. Battles were brutal. Knights led charges, stormed castles, and clashed in melee. Sieges were long, exhausting, and deadly. It wasn't just about sword fights, it was about endurance, tactics, and sometimes sheer luck. Death could come quickly or slowly. The Code of Chivalry, a set of rules knights were expected to follow, is one of the most romanticized aspects of knighthood. But what did it actually mean? Chivalry emphasized loyalty to your lord, bravery in battle, protection of the weak, respect for women, especially noble women, faith in God. However, this code was more ideal than reality. Knights often raided villages, fought in petty feuds, and weren't above cruelty. The church tried to control knightly violence through movements like the Peace and Truce of God, urging knights not to attack clergy, peasants, or churches. It was only partially effective. Throughout the Middle Ages, knights were the armored fist of European warfare. On the battlefield, they relied on a wide array of weapons, from swords and axes to crushing maces and warhammers. Each tool served a purpose, adapted to the demands of different enemies and evolving armor. The sword stood out, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of status, of class, of purpose. Unlike a hunting spear or a farmer's axe, the knight's sword was crafted solely for combat. It was elegant, deadly, and largely ceremonial off the field. While it was effective against lightly armored foes, it lacked the punch needed against solid plate. For that, knights turned to heavier instruments, blunt maces or warhammers, weapons designed to smash through metal. But no knight went into battle without defense, and at the core of that defense stood the shield. Early on, shields were simple, oval-shaped, wooden, and about half an inch thick. They were designed to be light enough to maneuver, but sturdy enough to absorb blows. As battlefield tactics changed, so did their shape. By the late 900s, these shields evolved into the kite shield, longer and curved, able to cover the leg of a mounted rider. During the height of chivalric warfare in the 1200s and early 1300s, the heater shield became popular, compact and iconic in design. Then, around the mid-14th century, a square variant appeared, the bouched shield, with a notch carved in to rest a lance during charges, blending offense with defense in a single gesture. For protection beneath the shield, the knight's primary defense for centuries was chainmail, or simply mail. Made of interlocking rings, it offered remarkable flexibility and solid protection against cuts. But it had weaknesses. Blunt weapons could crush bones beneath it, and pointed weapons, like arrows or lances, could penetrate the gaps. To help absorb shock and prevent the rings from rubbing into the skin, knights wore a padded underlayer called an aketon. It acted like a cushion, vital in the chaos of combat. In warmer regions, chainmail presented another problem: heat. Under the sun, those metal rings became unbearably hot. To counter this, knights wore flowing garments over their armor, sleeveless surcoats. These not only helped with temperature, but proudly displayed a knight's heraldic arms, their identity in cloth. Over time, these garments evolved into distinctive coats like the tabard and waffenrock, blending function with family pride. Head protection also evolved dramatically. In the earlier medieval period, knights wore open-faced helmets, nasal helms, and spangenhelms, which provided only partial coverage. These helmets allowed for visibility and hearing, but left much of the face exposed. As warfare intensified, so did the need for better protection. By the late 12th century, the great helm emerged, a heavy, enclosing iron box that shielded the entire head. It was a drastic change, safer, but also hotter, heavier, and harder to see through. Beneath it, many knights wore a smaller cap, the bassinet. Over time, this too evolved. By the 14th century, the bassinet became a full combat helmet in its own right, often fitted with visors that could be lifted or locked into place. One of the most infamous designs was the hound's cull, or pig-faced visor, shaped to deflect blows and arrows, while giving the knight a somewhat fearsome profile. Then came a major shift in armor, the age of plate. Starting in the 13th century, knights began reinforcing their mail with metal plates mounted on leather or fabric. This early coat of plates gave added protection to the torso. Gradually, more parts of the body were armored. Elbows and shoulders were guarded with metal discs called rondelles, which evolved into articulated systems covering the upper and lower arms, the rear brace and vambrace, all connected to the shoulder guards known as spalding or pauldrons. The legs were not neglected. Early on, only the shins were shielded with partial plates called shinbalds. But by the mid-1300s, full greaves were used, enclosing the lower legs entirely. The thighs were covered by cuisses, rounding out the full leg armor set. The result was a knight encased in steel from head to toe, a walking fortress. And this new plate armor had a clear advantage over mail. It could deflect arrows, absorb strikes, and especially protect against crossbow bolts, the bane of knights for over a century. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, plate armor had reached its peak, strong, articulated, and surprisingly mobile for its weight. Some knights could run, climb, and even remount a horse while fully armored. It was the golden age of chivalric steel. Even as gunpowder weapons emerged, plate armor held its ground. Cavalry units known as cuirassiers, like England's London Lobsters, continued wearing plate into the early 1600s, often equipped with breastplates and helmets designed to resist bullets. But it wasn't just the knight who bore armor. Their horses, too, were clad for war. In earlier times, horses were covered with cloth caparisons, decorative but functional coverings that echoed the knight's own surcoat. As warfare evolved, metal protection for horses became more common. The chanfron was one of the earliest examples. A plate fitted over the horse's head, often ornate but deadly serious in purpose. Fully armored war horses, known as destriers, were powerful beasts trained for combat, shock charges, and even to strike with hooves. With their own armor and trained aggression, they were not merely transportation, but partners in war. Not all knightly combat was on the battlefield. Tournaments were a huge part of medieval knightly culture. Originally chaotic mock battles, tournaments evolved into more regulated events, and jousting became the star attraction. Two knights charged each other on horseback, aiming to unhorse their opponent with a lance. These events were both dangerous and glamorous. They were watched by nobles and often hosted by royalty. Knights could win fame, money, and the favor of noble ladies, but they could also die or suffer severe injuries. Tournaments also served as training for real war, and they were expensive. both in terms of equipment and prestige. Only wealthy knights or those sponsored by nobles could afford to compete regularly. One of the most defining aspects of medieval knighthood were the Crusades. These were military campaigns sanctioned by the Church aiming to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Starting in 1096, the First Crusade called on knights across Europe to take up the cross. It was seen as both a religious duty and an opportunity to gain land, loot, and eternal salvation. Knights fought in brutal conditions, far from home, facing unfamiliar enemies and climates. Some formed religious military orders like the Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights. These orders combined monastic life with military duty, but the Crusades also led to atrocities, including massacres of civilians, looting of cities, and cultural destruction. They reshaped knightly identity, blending religion, warfare, and power in dangerous ways. Outside of war and tournaments, knights were also landowners and local rulers. A knight might be granted a fief, land and peasants, in exchange for military service. They acted as local judges, tax collectors, and protectors. They held courts, enforced laws, and could raise small armies if needed. Their homes weren't castles, those were reserved for high nobles, but manor houses, fortified but simpler. A knight's day-to-day life involved overseeing his estate, training, and upholding his reputation. Reputation was everything. A cowardly knight could be disgraced and lose everything. Family life was also part of the equation. Many knights married noble women for political alliances. Their children were raised with the same expectations. Sons trained for war, daughters trained for marriage and estate management. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the golden age of knights began to fade. Why? Technology changed. Longbows and crossbows could pierce armor. Gunpowder weapons like cannons made castles obsolete. Large standing armies, not individual knights, began to dominate warfare. The 100 Years' War, the rise of professional soldiers, and centralizing monarchies all chipped away at the knight's role. By the Renaissance, the armored knight was more of a symbol than a real military force. But the idea of the knight, noble, brave, and honorable, lived on in books, poetry, and later in movies and video games. So, were knights truly noble defenders of honor? Sometimes. Were they brutal warriors with a hunger for land and fame? Often. The truth is, knights were human, complex, flawed, courageous, and violent. The myth of the knight has lasted for centuries, and while the armor may be gone, the legend still inspires us. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the medieval world, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us, which knightly tale fascinates you most?